Our next speaker is Cory Doctorow. And Cory Doctorow, I'm sure everybody here has heard or at least read some of Cory Doctorow's work. He's a science fiction author. He's an activist. He's a journalist. He's the author of several books. I'm not going to list them all off, but Homeland, Little Brother. He's writing another book right now for younger readers. Called Poesy the Monster Slayer. And he blogs quite consistently at lots of different places, with Pluralistic, Boing Boing, and also on his own website. And he is a special consultant at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's really late, and I'm getting a little tired here. But nonetheless, I'm really excited to welcome Cory Doctorow to talk about the importance of decentralization and the opportunities here for the resurgence of cypherpunk ideologies. I'll hand it over to you, Cory.
Hear me? No. Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? I just want to make sure I've got the right mic. Apparently I had a problem yesterday. Do you hear that tapping?
That's the one.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. So I want to start by trying to correct the record a little on the subject of technological optimism or utopianism. There is a kind of alternate history that we're being told about the movement to see technology as a force for good in the world and to adapt technology as a force for good in the world, which is that the people who are the progenitors of this were kind of blind to the negative possibilities, that the reason that they got involved was because they thought that technology would solve all of our problems, and we just needed to clear everything out of the way so that technology could get on with doing its good work as a kind of force unto itself with its own imperatives. And I do think that there are some imperatives related to technology, but I don't think that's why the digital liberties or the digital rights movement started. I don't think you go out and found an organization like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, for example, if you think that things will be automatically amazing and you just have to wait for the technology to deliver those dividends. The reason that you get involved in these struggles is it's a double-edged sword, right? It's the belief on the one hand that technology could create a transformative, prosperous improvement to the lives of lots and lots of people. And on the other hand, you are deathly afraid that in the absence of good evidence-based technology policy, technology could be a force for incredible repression and wickedness, right? And bad things in the world. It could make people's lives a lot worse. And so I think it's true that there were and are technological optimists, but I think that the kind of mainstream of the digital rights movement is animated not by a fatalistic belief that things will automatically be amazing, nor by the fatalistic belief that it's too late to do anything about it, but rather by the very hopeful and human proposition that this could all be so great if we don't screw it up, that there is room for human agency to decide which of those technological futures we arrive at. And the problem of getting technology right is it shares a lot of characteristics with some of our other more pernicious problems. Any problem that we have where cause and effect are separated by a lot of time and space is intrinsically hard to solve because it's hard to iterate. It's hard to understand the causal relationships between what we do and what comes of it. Think about the climate crisis, right? If every time you drove your car to the store, a bush on your front lawn caught fire from global warming, it would be pretty easy to understand the relationship of hydrocarbons to climate change. But the fact is that climate change has a long fuse. And so the problems of emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere are hard to understand even with the best of faith. But also, and this is also similar to the problem of technological optimism and pessimism, there is a business model for sowing doubt about bad choices in the climate, right? The longer that we can hold off on recognizing the thing that is obvious to almost everyone now, which is that climate change is real, it's a crisis, it is the result of human activities, and it's caused primarily by burning hydrocarbons. The more money the people who profit from hydrocarbons can make. And so the business model of sowing doubt about climate change takes this already pernicious problem, which is understanding the causal relationships between millions of distributed acts and the outcomes that may occur years later and halfway around the world, and it multiplies the problem of getting that hard problem right by adding in expensively sown doubt, by producing a capital that can be used to undermine our understanding and our consensus about what is really going on in the world. And so it creates a kind of reality debt, right, where we are acting as though one thing is true, even though it's increasingly obvious that something else is true, like we can burn hydrocarbons forever and nothing bad will happen. And we see this a lot in technology policy. Privacy being a very good example of this. uh, it's hard to trace any one small disclosure of personal identifying information to a negative consequence. Generally speaking, giving your email address and a password to some random website isn't going to hurt you. But if you do it enough times, eventually there will be enough leaks that they will be combined in enough novel ways that something bad will happen to you, right? And in the same way that no one puff on a cigarette is going to give you a tumor, but if you smoke enough cigarettes for enough time, eventually you'll get cancer. And attributing that cancer retrospectively to any one puff on a cigarette is impossible, but stochastically, probabilistically, we know that the fact that you smoked all your life is to blame for the tumor in your lung. And this denial problem is the hard problem of our civilization and of our current moment. And denial has an identical twin, rather, or a twin on the other side, which is nihilism. If you are in denial for long enough about a real problem, eventually the reality debt that you've built up will accumulate so much interest that you will have to pay the bill, right? That you will have a bankruptcy event, right? Eventually, if you don't take care of public health, eventually you will get a pandemic. Eventually, if you don't take care of privacy, there will be horrible breaches that ruin people's lives. Eventually, if you don't address climate change, the coastal cities of the world will be submerged under warm sewage laden water, right? In the nature of these reality debts. But when the reality debt asserts itself, when the bankruptcy comes to you, it is easy to become a nihilist. It is easy to say, well, so much time has gone by that it is now too late for me to do anything about this. And therefore, I might as well just get on with my life, right? So we've all known smokers who get cancer eventually and say, well, it's too late now. I might as well enjoy the last few years I have and light another cigarette. The climate version of this is stuff like saying, well, I know that for years you've been warning me that rhino populations are crashing. I now acknowledge that this is obviously true because there's only one rhino left. But since there's only one rhino left, why don't we find out what he tastes like, right? And in privacy, well, you get this all the time, right? Right now, you've got Google and Fitbit contemplating a merger, and that the response to that, when people say, well, okay, here are all these Fitbit users who in part became Fitbit users because they didn't want to use Google as their fitness tracker, because they didn't want to give Google more data. And now they're being opted in retrospectively by this merger. And the response is often, well, Google already knows everything about you anyway. Why shouldn't we allow them to acquire this other silo full of data that users explicitly opted not to give them in the first place? So that nihilism is something that we need to fight. Um, our tech policy has been full of very expensive denial that has produced some really terrible outcomes. And to the extent that this horrible, ghastly, world destroying pandemic has a silver lining, it's that, notwithstanding the possibility that we might get a string of pandemics because we may not acquire permanent immunity or develop an effective vaccine, this pandemic, compared to some of the other crises that we have looming on our horizon, is if not minor, it is at least bounded in a way that some of those other crises are not. The climate crisis that's looming is effectively unbounded in terms of the harms that it will do both to us individually and to our health and our family, and also to our economies, structures, and civilization. And so, if the moment at which the debt comes due is when climate change just cannot be denied, irrespective of how much money you make off of the hydrocarbon industry, then it will really be too late to do anything about climate change. We kind of need a wake up call before that moment arrives. And the pandemic is kind of that moment, right? The pandemic is the moment that shows us just how poorly equipped we are to cope with crises. And yet, because it's a bounded event, right? Because we are, if not certain, at least relatively confident that this is a matter of a year or two, after which we will have a relatively good handle on this particular crisis, then we can start thinking about what we are going to do, how we're going to use the fracture lines that this crisis reveals to ensure that the future crises that emerge do not catch us flat-footed the way that this does. Right? It's like being someone who never wears their seatbelt, who finally gets into a wreck but only breaks their arm, right? And it's, breaking your arm is a terrible thing, but for sure you're going to wear your seatbelt after that. So let's talk about some of the lessons for technology of the pandemic, the fracture lines that were revealed by the pandemic. The first and most obvious one is that online life is real life. So one of the traditional ways in which the digital rights movement has been dismissed is by arguing that digital rights are a distraction from the real fights over real human rights and real civil rights. When Finland enshrined the access to broadband as a human right in its constitution, many people around the world just made fun of them. They said, and this was in the kind of IRC and 2.5D game era, and they said, really, playing side scrollers and chatting on AOL Instant Messenger as a human right? Give me a break, right? Real human rights are those things that are being abused in the Sudan, or those things that are being abused in torture chambers. They're not these things that are being abused when your ISP won't give you broadband. And later on, you had people like Malcolm Gladwell, who penned quite influential essays saying, the real civil rights movement involved protesters facing down Bull Connor on a bridge in Alabama and having the police dogs released against them. It's not real civil rights movements do not involve clicking on a mouse and typing on a keyboard. But it's become extremely obvious that every part of our life involves the internet, and most parts of our lives require the internet, including the exercise of most of the human rights that we think of as important. I mean, it's not just that, as we see, the supply chain for food is intensely dependent on networks, right? And in part because there are efficiencies that you can realize by using networking technology to improve industrial processes, but also because when things go wrong, when there are failures in the supply chain, it's networks that allow us to find out what's going on. It's networks that allow us to source alternate sources. It's networks that allow us to poll our neighbors and the people nearby us to find out who needs help or who can offer it. And so, all the way down to whether or not you starve to death, the internet is absolutely co-terminal with human rights, and it is a necessary but insufficient precondition for the exercise of your human rights in the 21st century and beyond. And it doesn't take a pandemic to show you that online politics are real politics. Our politics have been fought in online forums for many years now, many election cycles in the US and the EU. But certainly this moment makes it absolutely undeniable, right? As we're discussing how the US will conduct its next national election, as other territories around the world either hold elections, delay elections, or make ready to hold future elections, the role that the internet plays in campaigning, in voting, in organizing, in holding town halls, and holding our politicians to account cannot be denied. So it's not just that online life is real life. Online politics are real politics. And anyone who dismisses online politics as mere clicktivism is not paying attention, is not serious, and shouldn't be taken seriously. And that extends into every other domain of our life, right? So online work is real work. For the 25 to 35% of us who are working exclusively from home, online work is the only work that we have. for people who are going into work to work, their jobs typically require the internet in to a greater or lesser extent, and that extent only has gone up over the last couple of decades and shows no end in sight. And so online work is real work. Online education is real education. For all those people who are keeping in touch with their romantic partners online now because they're sheltering in different places, or who are making new romantic partners through the internet, online romance is real romance. Online familiar relations are real familiar relations. The Zoom call I have with my family in Toronto from here in California every Monday night is my family relation. It is how my family and I stay in touch. And so all of the arguments about whether we should be treating the digital world with the gravitas and seriousness that we address the real world have effectively been settled. And so that raises some important questions for what's going to happen after the crisis, what lessons we've learned and what we can do after the crisis. I think the first one on is about broadband provisioning and network neutrality. It is now obvious to anyone who lives in an advanced nation whose broadband provisioning was managed by the private sector that the private sector cannot allocate well for broadband provisioning. This is obvious in the US, where we lag the rest of the world, the rich world in fiber development, but it's also obvious in most of the rest of the wealthy world. And in case there was any doubt, we, as of this week, have, or last week rather, have Frontier's bankruptcy filings in which they are incredibly frank about the calculus that led them not to deploy fiber to their customers' homes. And it's this: they have 1 million households that they serve where they are the only ISP. They have successfully lobbied the state legislatures in the states where those households are to prohibit cities from fielding a competitive offering. And that lobbying effort was cheaper than maintaining adequate infrastructure for those million families. For another 3 million customers, they could have deployed fiber and made about $1.9 billion over 10 years, but they wouldn't have started making that money until the 10th year, right? That's when the amortization schedule starts kicking into profit, right? And so amortizing out that cost over 10 years was the thing that they knew that the Wall Street analysts who were in charge of their share price and determined not just how much capital the company had, but also, the net worth of the executives in the company and how much the bonuses for those executives were worth, because they were mostly in share grants, how much they were worth. And so as a practical matter, the company would not undertake any deployment of any infrastructure that had a more than 5-year amortization schedule. And so 3 million households in the US who could have been profitable fiber customers years ago are still struggling with last century DSL copper infrastructure. So it's obvious now in retrospect that broadband is really important, and letting the private sector decide where it goes is like letting the private sector decide where the Autobahn goes or the interstate goes. That this is a thing that should be under democratic control, not a hostage to the parochial interests of large firms. And let us not forget that none of these firms are creatures of the market, right? If you are Frontier or Verizon or British Telecom or Deutsche Telekom, or if you are the French national carrier or Telia or any of the other telcos, your rights of way through major cities across whole countries and continents, those rights of way are not available as commodities that you could purchase on the market. There is no pool of money large enough for Verizon to buy the rights of way through, say, Manhattan, to allow it to wire up every building in Manhattan. Those rights of way are only available through the intervention of the state. And so every one of these carriers is the beneficiary of an unpriceable, incalculably precious public grant, a public subsidy, without which they could not possibly operate as a profitable venture. And so I think that when you take the king's shilling, you owe a debt of duty to the public interest. And I think that it's obvious in retrospect that all along we should have been saying, look, guys, if you want to build the Going Galt network, by all means, go and try and bid the price of every right of way. But if you're going to take a public subsidy, then you've got to give the public what they ask for. And so it's pretty obvious that, for example, network neutrality should have been a slam dunk. Network neutrality, after all, is the principle that if you have a customer who clicks on a link to get a resource from the internet, that what you should do is give that customer that resource as quickly as possible, as quickly as you can technically achieve that accomplishment, right? And that your calculus about how much priority that packet should have should be determined solely by whether or not your customer wants it, not whether the entity that provides that resource, the whether it's Google or a small independent website or Netflix or anyone else in the world, not whether they have paid the carrier a bribe to deliver those packets, right? There is no public interest argument that goes, we have been given a huge public subsidy to provide internet to the public, but we are not going to give the resources that the public wants priority. We are going to give the resources that please our shareholders priority. That is a nonsense on its face, and the crisis has revealed it. The next element that's been surely revealed by the crisis is the importance of allowing for decentralization and for work to take place at the edge. So all of our industries have become incredibly concentrated. Telecoms, obviously, but also IT and tech more broadly, also media, also finance. The eyeglasses I'm wearing come from a company called Oliver Peoples. Oliver Peoples is one of about 75 eyewear brands that are now all owned by a single private equity-backed firm in Italy called Luxottica. They also own every major high street eyewear retailer in the West. They also own the largest lab and the largest eyewear insurer. And so every industry has undergone massive concentration. And the standard account of why tech has become so concentrated is that something about network effects and first mover advantages confer natural benefits to tech. And that's why tech became so concentrated and why the whole web has turned into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. But it's pretty clear that these cannot be the full account of why tech got so concentrated. After all, if first mover advantage is what leads to market concentration, where is the first mover advantage that made Luxottica the only eyewear brand that any of us can patronize? How is it that we had 30 pro wrestling leagues in North America 25 years ago, and now we just have one pro wrestling league, and it is abusing its monopsony and monopoly power to do all kinds of terrible things, most notably, especially in light of the crisis, they took away all of their wrestlers' healthcare insurance. And now those wrestlers are begging on GoFundMe for money to die with dignity in their 50s from the injuries they sustained in the ring. So it can't just be first mover advantage. It can't just be network effects. And I think it's far more likely that the reason we've seen such centralization of our resources is that we stopped enforcing laws that prohibited centralization. Right up until the year the Apple II Plus hit the shelves, up until 1980 and the Ronald Reagan Revolution, which was picked up around the world by Thatcher, by Helmut Kohl, by Brian Mulroney in Canada, by Augusto Pinochet in Chile, very notoriously. Most advanced economies had laws in place that prohibited monopolistic conduct, including and especially mergers to monopoly, which is when 2 large firms merge. The acquisition of nascent competitors, the catch and kill strategy, where you buy a small company that looks like it might grow to someday challenge you, and you either destroy that company or you integrate it into your own company so that its challenge is neutralized. So think of Facebook buying Instagram. Or the establishment of vertical monopolies, the idea that you could both own a platform and compete with the users of the platform. So banks were historically prohibited from starting businesses that competed with the businesses they lent money to. Railroad companies weren't allowed to own freight companies that competed with the freight shippers whose freight they were carrying. But today, Apple can own an app store and make apps and put them in the app store. Amazon can own a platform and make products that are clones of the products that its own sellers create. And as the Wall Street Journal reported this week, they do that by breaking their promise and secretly mining the data of their own customers, the proprietary data, to figure out how to clone them and when. And so we can see how these firms got really big and centralized. They just cheated. Right? They didn't grow through network effects. Google didn't grow through network effects. Google is a company that only ever made 1.5 successful products. Right? They made a really good search engine and a pretty good Hotmail clone. And every other successful market entry that they've had has been the result of an acquisition. Google bought 200 companies last year. Apple bought 50 companies in the first month of 2019. Right? These are conglomerates that buy companies more often than you and I buy groceries. And so the centralization of these firms has been fully revealed. And the crisis has revealed what's wrong with that centralization, which is that it's brittle. right? If you are reliant on a single firm for providing you internet access, for providing educational access, for providing access to employment, for providing access to a video conference like this one, and that firm has a failure, or that firm is not reachable because there's an infrastructural failure between you and them, or there is they decide to exercise their monopoly power either deliberately to discriminate against you or inadvertently, like maybe they just Facebook's moderators make a bad decision and kick your whole giant group where you're planning something important off. Facebook has very recently started to kick off people who are documenting coronavirus misinformation as part of their program to kick off actual coronavirus misinformation. This is a pretty important own goal for them to have scored. And so we see the problem with this centralization, which is that in times of extremis, when you have a centralized economy, those centralized points become points of failure, centralized points of failure. Writ large, we see it with the relocation of all manufacturing to China, where as the supply lines between China and the rest of the world broke down, and as Chinese manufacturing itself was severely compromised by their pandemic outbreak, you started to see the rest of the world suffering. And one of the reasons we can't get N95 masks and ventilator parts and all the other things that we need is because of this. We also see it in the arrogation for proprietary reasons by firms of the right to control service of their products, as a thing that magnifies crisis. Because if the only company that's allowed to fix your ventilator is the company that made the ventilator, and the company that made the ventilator can't be reached because there's a pandemic, and the pandemic is the reason you need the ventilator, well, then you're in really big trouble. And so we're seeing that the right to repair, which has been theoretical for a lot of people, has suddenly become very sharp edged and taken on this new urgency, because the right to repair is bad enough when the reason you can't get something fixed is that the company has decided that the product has reached its end of life and they want you to buy a new one, or the company has decided that they want to extract monopoly rents by forcing you to use their authorized service depots, and you can't go to the independent mechanic or repair sector that you want to use. But it's especially urgent when that company's decisions leave you with no option, including patronizing the monopolist, because the monopolist is not available, can't be reached, or has had its capacity completely absorbed by the crisis. And you see this also, that you see revealed the fracture lines created by filters. So particularly in the European Union, there has been a vogue to create what some people call the filter net, where the European approach to these monopolistic firms has been to, rather than try and make them smaller, to instead invest them with state-like duties. So you look at Google and you say, well, trying to break up Google would be a 20-year prospect and cost us billions of euros in courts. So rather than do that, why don't we take all the dysfunction that Google is responsible for and force them to address it through a compliance burden, where we'll just say, okay, from now on, if terrorists use Google, Google has 1 hour to detect it and remove the terrorist content. That's the kind of gist of the terror regulation that was passed by the European Union last year. Or you might say, in the context of copyright infringement, that anyone who operates a platform where the public is allowed to speak must install a filter similar to YouTube's Content ID and automatically block any speech, audiovisual content, any code, any text that matches anything in a database of notionally copyrighted works. And that database is created by anyone putting anything in it, pointing to it and saying, I own this copyright, which creates this enormous opportunity for mischief, right? Because it allows anyone to censor anything merely by claiming copyright in it. And if you look at something like the Lumen database that tracks these copyright claims, you'll see an enormous spike during the crisis of bogus copyright claims, copy fraud that is being used to remove content, including things that are really important, including things like debunking of conspiracy theories that you might want to see. That this is an equal opportunity super weapon for anyone to use in bad faith. All you need to do is point to something, say that's my copyright, and the filters will automatically remove it. The filters also have the impact of making it much harder to compete with the incumbents. If operating a platform in Europe now costs 100 million euros over and above the infrastructure costs just to build your copyright filter, well, then there are only about 5 companies in the world that have the 100 million euros to build that filter. And they're mostly giant American companies, along with one or two giant Russian companies and two or three giant Chinese companies, which effectively means that you've excluded European technologists from the European tech sector. And that takes all of the fragility that we've just been discussing and makes it even worse. So the pandemic is going to end. It is a bounded crisis. And when the pandemic ends, we are going to have the opportunity to address these fracture lines. And we are also going to have a duty to be vigilant, because the pandemic is setting up lots of opportunities for the crisis to, for the next crisis to be even worse, for our infrastructure to be made less resilient, for concentration to be more sharp. So, for example, the pandemic is going to bankrupt lots of firms, crazy number of firms. And when it does, there will be a huge move to consolidate those firms by the winners, right? So Amazon obviously is doing very well as a result of the crisis. Jeff Bezos has added $26 billion to his fortune since the crisis began. They've already started to snap up giant companies like Deliveroo that have been hit by cash crunches. So you will see a massive move to monopolization during and after the crisis as a consequence of the bankruptcies that the crisis will engender. We have to really be on our lookout to prevent those from spreading. And there should be very strict merger scrutiny and very strict acquisition scrutiny. And any company that took on public capital to stay afloat should be prohibited from selling itself, right? The idea of getting public monies is not to make yourself an acquisition target. It's to keep the lights on and keep your business running. We are going to see a resurgence of the cryptography wars. And at the top of this, Laurent mentioned the cypherpunk ideology. There were and are elements in the cypherpunk movement who believe that you could build a kind of permanent demimonde of cryptographically secured private civilizations that coexisted alongside the dominant civilization, and whose rights would come from their technology and not from a responsive and legitimate state. I think that those people talked loud, but they didn't represent a majority of the people who advocate for cryptography. I think that history's lesson to us has been that while the math of cryptography is beautiful and robust, that the implementations of cryptography and the people who use cryptography are much less robust than the abstract mathematics that underpins it. And so if an adversary tries long and hard enough, they can suborn your cryptography either by suborning one of the people you've entrusted with your secrets, right? So they may never get your key, but they may get someone who you've been communicating with to decrypt the messages you sent them, or by finding flaws in the implementation of the systems that you're using, or by using malware implants to attack you. And so for me, I think the only virtue of a cryptographic demimonde is to provide a kind of shelter from which we can plan the movement that we need to make our governments responsive and legitimate. That ultimately the thing that forestalls rubber hose cryptanalysis, which is when someone ties you to a chair and hits you with a rubber hose until you tell them your password, is not longer key lengths. It's making it illegal for states to practice rubber hose cryptanalysis, right? It's having the transparency and the pluralism that makes states dependent on the electorate and responsive to them when they seek to act. And that too, I think, is our only real defense against the permanentization of the contact tracing. As we saw after 9/11 with the Patriot Act and the special measures taken elsewhere in the world to fight terrorism, that those measures that are meant to be temporary and special become permanent and entrenched and endure effectively forever, and just find new excuses, right? So if contact tracing is useful to find people who come in contact with the pandemic, and also useful to find children who've been kidnapped, and also useful to solve murders, then as soon as it's used to do either of those two latter things, there will be a constituency lobbying for its extension into the indefinite future. And we've had the power to track everyone all the time for a long time, and we didn't do it not because it was technically challenging, but because it was wrong, because those kinds of incursions into our privacy may be effective at stopping some kinds of crime, but they're also effective at stopping many of the virtuous things that we want from our society, like the ability of people to think and speak freely and be their actual selves, be their authentic selves, which is, after all, how we arrived at this moment where so many of the values that we cherish have become mainstream. Gay marriage didn't become legalized because everyone was gay was forced to reveal that they were gay to everyone they knew at one moment, and then everyone realized that gay marriage should be legal. Gay marriage was legalized because every gay person could choose the time and manner in which they came out and who they came out to, and build networks of allies that could back them to create the normative shift that made gay marriage a possibility. Revealing all of the people who hold a disfavored view or engage in a disfavored practice all at once doesn't make societal change. It just makes it easy to figure out who to round up and stick in jail. And so, that's where I want to end this, is by saying that when the pandemic ends, it's going to be really important, more than anything else, to attend to democracy, to attend to pluralism, to attend to the idea that our states must be responsive, and that the use of technology as a liberating tool is as a means of insisting on those values from our lawmakers and regulators, not as a means of seceding from them. Because if there's one thing we've learned from the pandemic, it's that it doesn't matter where you live. We have a shared destiny. We have a shared climate. We have a shared microbial nation, and we have a shared ethical duty to one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Cory. Wow, what an inspiring talk. Just as I was expecting.
Well, thank you.
So let's open it up to questions now. Lots of people have their hand.
Hey, Cory.
Hey.
I'm from Toronto.
The
kind
city
of
that never sleeps in.
What's that?
The city that never sleeps in.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm actually from Mississauga, so a little more
Oh, there you
sleepy
go.
country here,
Right.
but I'm gonna ask something from the maybe left field, but just maybe just get your take on it. I've been watching the Star, and last 2 days they're kind of throwing this kind of, it's almost like social engineering. They're like, asking like the question, should the vaccine be mandatory? And then today Bruce, who's one of the columnists there, is like, we can't undermine a truly scientific miracle, and it's kind of like over the top. I don't know, just get your comment on that.
Well, I guess a hypothetical vaccine is hard to make concrete statements about, but in general, I think
Well, that's exactly it. That's what they're
Right.
saying. They're like, it's a truly scientific miracle, and society should force you to do this. And it's like, wait, no one's ever proved this thing even real and tested, and so we're already being asked to accept it.
Right.
So it's kind of like a laying some groundwork. So kind of interesting, but yeah, I want to get your take. Sorry.
Well, so obviously it's in the context of the anti-vaccination movement, right? And so they're trying to kind of make some normative interventions ahead of the anti-vax movement's claims about it. So, I think that if we assume that there is a vaccine and the vaccine works and it works well and it requires that to attain herd immunity, that it be widely administered. And also that, like many other vaccines, it is there are people who can't safely take it because they're immunocompromised or for other reasons. Then this is one of those problems of our shared microbial destiny, right? That your choice to be an infection reservoir is not yours alone, right? It's more like, well, why can't I store plutonium in my backyard? After all, it's my backyard. And we do admit of certain limits on individual agency as a condition of living in a wider society. I am of the view that mandatory vaccination for those whom it is safe for vaccines that have been determined to be effective is a mark of civilization, right? And in part, I think because I grew up with some pretty haunting stories about epidemics. My grandmother was a civil defense worker in the siege of Leningrad when she was a child. She was in the military for 3 years, from the age of 12 to the age of 15. And she was present through the waves of cholera that swept through Leningrad during the siege. And obviously, it's a bacterial infection. You don't vaccinate it in the same way. But it is one of those things where you get cholera because your neighbors have cholera. And when you get cholera, it kills you and the people you love. And not dying and having the right to not die, I think, is more important than the right of your neighbor to bodily sovereignty for an intervention that is for which we have good evidence that it is safe. Now, there's that involves a lot of caveats, right? So does the vaccine work? Is it effective? Is it safe? Those are all questions that are about a hypothetical vaccine that, as you say, doesn't exist yet. But when we're talking about MMR, for me, it's a no-brainer, right? When we're talking about other widely used vaccines that are on the schedule that my daughter had as a baby and that I've had and so on, I think that's a no-brainer. Flu vaccine, I think, is a no-brainer. As many people who dismiss the danger from the coronavirus suddenly discovered at the start of this pandemic, the flu is incredibly deadly and just kills the shit out of people. And we could do a lot more to fight the flu if we had more widespread vaccination. So yeah, I mean, this is the place where it is difficult to be an absolutist about certain principles, because your decision to be an infectious reservoir does not affect you alone, in the same way that your decision to keep plutonium in your backyard does not affect you alone.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, like, sometimes when we talk, we kind of amp up the level of threat. So that's kind of where I see this could be played. So if some of these diseases affect like widespread groups of people, and they're comparing Ebola to this, people at Stanford don't think that's the case. But anyway, so the reason that we should be more wary is because we don't actually know the statistics of harm. So if you've probably seen the CDC whistleblower who said, look, their data says this is linked to autism. That's just coming out now, 2004. So basically, there's data on the ground that we know that is really relevant, and that's not been looked at appropriately. So anyway,
I have to say that it's just untrue that there hasn't been a lot of work on the question of the link of autism to vaccination. The link has been explored a lot. If there was one report that we didn't see, it is not the only report that we've seen. There has been widespread, replicated, gold standard, large scale research on this. But even stipulating this, the idea that it's better for your child to die than to get autism is grossly offensive to people who have autism or on the spectrum. I just think I'm sorry, I just don't accept the premise.
Yeah, you need to look at the research, but I don't want to get into a big debate here. But you need to look at the research, because it's not so cut and dry as you say.
I've spent a really long time looking into this question, because
then you know the CDC work, you know the whistleblower, you know their own data.
But you see, the thing is, there are also scientists who deny climate change, right? The question isn't whether a scientist dissents. Dissent is healthy and part of the scientific process. But the way that we understand the reality as best as we understand it is not by looking at outliers. It's by looking at what the outliers say and seeing whether or not the outliers are in accord or out of accord with the published empirical data that we know about. So I'd strongly recommend, since you've given me a reading list, I'd strongly recommend reading Ben Goldacre's book on this. It's a book called Bad Science. He was the science critic for The Guardian. He's an epidemiologist. He is the lead of the evidence-based medicine movement in the UK. He's responsible for the Register of All Trials that requires all pharmaceutical trials to now be pre-registered, so that the pharma industry can't opt out of publishing its data on some trials. And he is the leading expert on this and has been sued multiple times by quacks for saying things like, no, AIDS is not a vitamin deficiency. So the guy who had been the health minister of South Africa is a German vitamin billionaire, sued him and he won. Ben won. He's also been sued by Gillian McKeith, who says that eating wheatgrass will help you because it will cause chlorophyll to oxygenate your blood. And he won his case against her as well. I mean, it's hilarious, because if wheatgrass is creating oxygen, it's only doing so because there's sunshine, and if you have sunshine in your colon, you have other problems, but also your colon can absorb oxygen, right? So he has been on this beat for a long time. He's an unimpeachable source, and I strongly recommend reading his work.
Glad to look at it. Definitely glad to look at it. Thanks for that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Cory, for your inspiring talk and for answering everyone's questions. Harry, I know you had a question, but unfortunately we're running a bit late, and we do need to move on to our second last speaker of the day, who is in here. So thanks again, Cory, and thanks
everyone. Go wash your hands.
Helping us promote this event on social media and everything. It's been really fantastic.
Right. Thank you.